The night before the Challenger launched, a group of engineers spent 12 hours on the phone with NASA, begging them not to do it. They had data, charts. They showed that the rubber seals keeping burning rocket exhaust from leaking through the booster joints, O-rings, had never been tested in temperatures like what was forecast for launch morning, 31 degrees Fahrenheit, below freezing. NASA's managers pushed back. The data wasn't conclusive enough. The launch window was closing. And then a senior Thiokol manager said something that has haunted engineers ever since. Take off your engineering hat and put on your management hat. They launched the next morning. Space Shuttle Challenger wasn't just another mission. NASA had spent years trying to make spaceflight feel ordinary, to show Americans the shuttle was not a prototype, but a reliable system, and nothing communicated that more than who they put on board. Krista McAuliffe was a high school social studies teacher from Concord, New Hampshire. She wasn't a pilot, she wasn't a scientist. She was chosen from more than 11,000 applicants to be the first private citizen in space, to teach lessons from orbit, to make an entire generation of American students look up. On January 28, 1986, millions of Americans watched the launch live. School children watched in classrooms. McAuliffe's own students in Concord watched. Her parents were in the stands. 73 seconds after launch, at 46,000 feet, Challenger broke apart. It wasn't an explosion, not in the way most people picture it. A structural failure caused the orbiter to disintegrate under aerodynamic forces. The crew cabin remained intact for more than 2 minutes before hitting the Atlantic at over 200 miles per hour. There is evidence some crew members were alive after the initial breakup. 7 people died: Francis Scobie, Michael Smith, Judith Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, Ronald McNair, Gregory Jarvis, and Krista McAuliffe. The failure wasn't a mystery, not to Roger Boisjoly. Boisjoly was an engineer at Morton Thiokol, the company that manufactured the solid rocket boosters. For months before the launch, he had been documenting a problem. The O-rings, the rubber seals between booster segments, showed signs of erosion on previous flights. He had written internal memos warning that cold temperatures made the rubber less resilient, less able to seal the joint before hot gases could escape. He had flagged it formally in writing. On the evening of January 27th, Boisjoly and his colleagues were on a conference call with NASA. They presented their data and recommended against launching. The forecast was 31 degrees. That was outside any temperature range the O-rings had been validated for. NASA's managers were not receptive. One asked whether Thiokol was recommending they wait until April. Another reportedly said, "My God, Thiokol, when do you want me to launch?" Thiokol's managers asked for a 5-minute recess. They went off the line. In that private conversation, a senior manager turned to his colleagues and said it plainly: "Take off your engineering hat and put on your management hat." Boisjoly said later he knew, in that moment, what the decision would be. The managers voted to launch. The engineers' objections were set aside. NASA received its green light. The question that should stay with us is not whether the people in that room were bad people. Most of them weren't. They were operating exactly as the organization had trained them to operate. Sociologist Diane Vaughan spent nearly a decade analyzing the Challenger decision-making process. Her conclusion wasn't that NASA was reckless. It was that NASA was rational, according to its own internal logic. She called it the normalization of deviance. On at least 9 previous shuttle flights, engineers had observed O-ring erosion, anomalies that by any objective measure were warning signs. But each time the shuttle came back intact. and each time it did, the anomaly was quietly reclassified, not as evidence of growing danger, but as evidence that the system could absorb a certain amount of damage and still succeed. Success, paradoxically, had made the risk invisible. What should have been a red flag became routine data. What should have triggered alarm had instead built confidence. By January 1986, NASA managers weren't ignoring the O-ring data. They had genuinely absorbed a belief, reinforced by years of successful launches, that erosion within a certain range was acceptable. Boisjoly's charts didn't fit that belief. So the belief won. This pattern does not belong to NASA alone. It is how organizations fail at scale. Safety rules exist until they are bent once without consequence, then bent again. Each successful near miss teaches the wrong lesson, that the margin is larger than it actually is, until the day it isn't. The Rogers Commission was formed to investigate the disaster, and it produced one of the most memorable moments in the history of scientific communication. Richard Feynman, Nobel laureate, Caltech professor, and commission member, was frustrated. He felt the hearings were moving slowly and that NASA's institutional culture was shaping the investigation, so during a recess, he did something no one expected. He took a small piece of O-ring material. He dropped it into a glass of ice water. He held it there, removed it, and compressed it between his fingers. "I believe this has some significance for our problem," he said. The O-ring had lost its resilience. It no longer snapped back. At the temperatures forecast for launch morning, the rubber could not seal the joint in time. The gas found a path. That was what killed 7 people. The commission also found something that captured the organizational failure precisely. NASA engineers had formally estimated the probability of catastrophic failure at 1 in 100,000. Independent experts estimated 1 in 100. The distance between those two numbers tells you everything about how institutions protect their own narratives, even from themselves. Roger Boisjoly testified. He described the teleconference, the pressure, the moment the decision was made without him. He became a whistleblower. For that, he was isolated by Thiokol. He left the company. He spent years speaking publicly about what had happened, but the professional cost was real and lasting. Changes were made. The shuttle flew again in 1988. In 2003, the Space Shuttle Columbia broke apart on re-entry. Foam insulation had struck the heat shield during launch. Engineers had flagged it. Managers had concluded it was not a serious concern. The normalization of deviance had returned. The engineers who tried to stop the Challenger launch weren't wrong. Their data was right. Their instincts were right. They were overruled, not because anyone believed they were mistaken, but because the organization had built a logic in which their warning could not be heard. What Challenger asks us is not whether we trust engineers. It's whether the systems we build allow dangerous truth to travel upward, or whether by the time it reaches anyone with authority, it has already been smoothed into something more comfortable. Because the alternative isn't that people stop seeing the warning signs. It's that they learn not to say anything about them.